So, as you might notice, the title is different because good news in the meantime between the organization of the panel and the presentation during the conference. And thank you so very much to CESRAN, to WAL for the great work in putting the program together, in making the necessary adjustments last minute as well. So thank you very much for all your work. And for this, as Licinia underlined, the resilience and the success of the conference is really amazing. So a change in title because it's published now. So it has been accepted and it's published. So you can find, that is why I will not go so deep in the case studies as such. I will really present the big lines of this research because it's already out now. So it's a comparison of the Czech and Portuguese engagements in the European defense market. And it's an analysis. So as I mentioned, it's already published. It's in the Journal of Common Market Studies. It's out since late August, so it's really, really fresh. It's a bit more than 50 days availability now, open access, so everyone can read it. You don't need to pay these fees to have access. So the title is Institutional Inertia and Change, explaining the Czech and Portuguese engagement in European defense market integration. This is a research that has been conducted with Thomas Weiss from the Charles University in Prague and Miroslava Pisklová, also from the same institution, and myself. So it's co-authored by Thomas and Miroslava and myself. So why?
Excuse me, Sandra.
Yes.
There is a pop-up in your PowerPoint from the PowerPoint. There's a pop-up, like a small window that is preventing us from seeing the full screen. Can you see it?
On the right down part of the screen.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see. Okay.
There you go.
Disappeared. Okay. Thank you very much
Perfect.
for this, Licinia. Okay. Now I will. Okay. So so you can access it directly by yourself online. So why this focus? Actually, the focus was on two initiatives that arose from 2017 onwards at the EU level, PESCO and EDF, so the European Defence Fund, which came a bit later, and the structured partnership for the whole idea is to try to integrate the defense market at the EU level. So the question that we raised in our research is why Czechia and Portugal engage differently in these two initiatives, both in terms of the negotiation phase, but also in their participation in the projects that were launched within the PESCO framework and also funded through the European Defence Fund. So this is a comparison between two small countries. We, of course, explain why we deem possible and important to compare these two countries. And they were both challenged by the integration of the European defense market that can be seen as both opportunities and risks for these two countries. So the risks are the ones that well known for the ones studying the European defense market. Is the size of the big companies of the big member states, the difficulties of the small countries to add value in the supply chains, so to add values in terms of value to their economies as well in this construction of the defense market. So we looked at their involvement until 2021. After that, the Russia-Ukraine war changed the context a lot, and context is important, of course, to look at these initiatives. But at the same time, despite the change in context, and of course, the huge amount of money that has now come into the EU defense sector because of the war in Ukraine, it cannot be translated into integration of defense market if it comes without institutions and previous efforts. So PESCO and EDF, and yesterday there was a conference of the European Defence Agency, the annual conference, and these projects were really into discussions in this conference. So despite the fact that our timeline goes until there, and we have this change in context, still these questions are so very much important to understand if the integration of the defense market is still possible at all in the new context of the war in Ukraine. So basically, we departed from not really a willingness to explain the EU defense market and the EU defense integration. Also, it's an input for that. We will really look at the domestic perspective. So how the public and the private sectors of these countries influenced the way these countries were able to jump into these initiatives, to contribute to them, but also to benefit from them. So we looked at the role of the institutions, public ones, but also the defense industries of these countries. And we tried to assess how these institutions, public and private, explain the difference of engagement, because there is a difference of engagement of these two countries. So the pertinency is about what is well known and usually called the military-industrial complex, which makes a huge linkages between the state procurements and the defense procurements, and also the fact that when we look at these initiatives, it's because also market consolidation in the defense sector in the EU never reached the same depths as that of the United States. So we are still in a world that is in the making, with the accelerator of that has been provoked by the war in Ukraine. So the main conclusions as I said, I will talk a bit more, of course, about the paper, but I will not go very deeply in the analysis because it's published now. But I give you the main conclusions right away, saying that we explain the differences of engagement between Portugal and Czechia. So Portugal engaged much more significantly. Despite being less active at the launch of the projects, it engaged much more significantly than Czechia. And we explain that by the differences of institutionalization in respective countries. So institutions explain, but they do not explain only the differences because of the different institutions, but also because of the ideas that were embedded by the actors in these institutions. So in terms of contribute to the literature, we used the framework of historical institutionalism. So as I said before, in terms of explaining the differences between the two, and our main argument is that existing institutions, so as both agency or even established ways of thinking, so as I said, ideas, explain why the evolution was distinct for the two nations' engagement. And as I said, the paper is really about understanding domestic institution, internal dimensions, and not really the defense industrial cooperation at the EU level per se. Okay, so it's really about the role of national institutions in policy formulation. But of course, the results, the outcomes of our research are useful to understand what's going on at the EU level as such, because Portugal and Czechia are two small states that are member states of both the EU and NATO. So we did a separation between three phases, 3 moments, 3 periods. First, the establishment of the defense industry or institutions of these countries before 2017. So before PESCO and EDF proposals. We looked at the negotiations phase of these proposals, and then at the implementation phase. So how these countries were involved in the first PESCO and EDF projects. So
5 minutes, Sandra.
How much?
5.
5, thank you very much. So we looked at 2 hypotheses. First, if we could explain the difference between the 2 countries by the existence of established institutions that govern the defense industry. And this institution usually cannot be easily changed. And then a second hypothesis that is not like disconnected or contradictory to the first one. It's actually a complementary one that was very useful for us to make the research, is if we can explain the difference by the distinct ideas embodied in and perpetuated by the defense industry institutions. And as I said, of course, besides the contribute to the literature of historical institutionalism, we also, of course, contribute to understanding better the practice of European defense cooperation. But I will just add here some additional, because I have at least 3 minutes more. I would not like to end like this the presentation. I would like to share a bit more about our conclusions. What was striking for us is that in fact, institutions pre-existing the initiatives were really a key difference for Portugal and Czechia. Portugal was already in the road of creating new institutions to be more active and to create a more efficient industry of defense in Portugal. And these initiatives came at a moment where Portugal was already in the movement, in the dynamic of institutional innovation to be a bigger player or better player and to serve its economy through the defense industry. The Czech Republic had already embedded institutions, and the state was already supporting the defense industry primarily through state acquisitions and offsets. So when the new structures came at the EU level, actually it didn't really mesh well with the cooperation logic that PESCO and EDF prescribed. So it was a real contrast with the Portuguese institution that had no resilient institutional structure in place for these defense industry policies. So when they came, it meant for Czechia reforming already embedded practices. For Portugal, it was just jumping, right? Seizing the opportunity, an additional opportunity to create new institutions and to change its way of engagement. And it was really clear as well in terms of ideas involved in these political priorities. So it translated into very active, Czechia was more active in the negotiation phase, in the initial phase, but then Portugal ended up with much more leading projects and more skeptical. We had to use a lot of interviews because we didn't have secondary resources to analyze what we wanted to analyze. And interviews really showed that difference between the two countries. So we also discovered that when it comes to defense industry policy in Europe at large, the EU level for these two countries were indeed secondary, okay? It didn't really change the dynamics of institutional change at the national level. Despite the fact that we can see the use of EU budget in defense policy as revolutionary before 2021, and I think we can try to draw some perspectives for the new context of the war in Ukraine, it was not triggering institutional change in the two countries, because in Czechia we had resistance. In Portugal, we already had a novelty happening. So it was, as I said, about creating more synergies with what could come from the EU level. So I will start here. I hope I was not too confusing, but as I said, the paper is out there. So for those interested, you can read it. Thank you very much for your attention. Lisinia.